Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Testing Psychologist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Sharp, licensed psychologist, group practice owner, and private practice coach. Many of y'all know that I have been using therapy notes as our practice EHR for over 10 years now. I've looked at others, and I just keep coming back to therapy notes because they do it all. If you're interested in an EHR for your practice, you can get 2 free months of therapy notes by going to thetestingpsychologist.com/therapy notes and enter the code TESTING. This podcast is brought to you in part by PAR. Hey, guess what, y'all? The Brief A has been updated. The Brief 2A is the latest update to the Brief 2 family. Use the gold standard in executive functioning assessment to assess adult clients. You can pre-order it now. Visit parinc.com/products/BRIEF2A. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Testing Psychologist. I am excited to be here with you to be talking about a topic that feels like we have needed to cover for a long, long time. Today, we're talking about neurodivergent affirming assessment with Dr. Matt Zakreski. So Matt is a high-energy, creative clinical psychologist and professional speaker who utilizes an eclectic approach to meet the specific needs of the neurodivergent community. He is proud to serve the gifted community as a consultant, a professor, an author, and a researcher. He's spoken hundreds of times all over the world about supporting neurodivergent kids. Dr. Zakreski is a member of Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted, National Association for Gifted Children, New Jersey Association for Gifted Children, and Pennsylvania Association for Gifted Education. Matt graduated from Widener University's Institute for Graduate Clinical Psychology in 2016, and he is the co-founder of the Neurodiversity Collective. So this is a really cool interview. Matt, I think you will see pretty quickly, is a very humble, very kind individual, easy to chat with. And we get into a number of areas related to neurodiversity-affirming assessment. So we start with some definitions around what is neurodivergent and what does it mean to be neurodivergent affirming. We talk some statistics about neurodivergence in our country. And then we get into some specific tips around neurodivergent affirming assessment practices. We talk about strategies for your website, for the scheduling process and paperwork, for financial communication, interviewing, questions, the testing process, and the report writing process. So we cover a lot of bases here, and I think there's a lot to take away from this podcast. If you are a practice owner and you would like some support in running your practice, my mastermind groups are full until January of 2025. But I have a couple spots open for individual consulting, either via a strategy session, which is a one-off hour, or a more ongoing one-on-one relationship. And you can get more info and schedule a call to chat about it at thetestingpsychologist.com/consulting. Let's get to my conversation with Dr. Matt Zakreski. Matt, hey, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
I am very glad to have you. Yeah, I don't know, I feel like I say this more and more often, which is an indicator of something, I don't know what, but I can't believe that we have gone this many episodes without talking explicitly about neurodiversity affirming assessment. It is such a hot topic that maybe will stay hot, maybe should not even be called hot because it's just part of the deal. We should be talking about it all the time, but it's super, it's super important over the last few years, and there's a lot of energy behind this particular topic. So all that to say, thank you for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Yeah. Well, that makes 2 of us. And yeah, I mean, it really is a fascinating thing for me because people are like, well, are you just like jumping on the hot new trend? And I sit there, I'm like, I don't know. Am I? Like, to me, this is what I live, right? This is my, this is sort of the way I see the world. So like, I don't know. I mean, I would love to make sure that, to me, it's like a restaurant, right? Like you want to be the hot new restaurant for a while, but then you just want to be the restaurant people go to. Like you just move to that, like it's part of the fabric of the community. I want in, a few years, 5 years, 10 years, that we just consider the needs of neurodivergent kids like we would consider the needs of handicapped kids, right? Or kids with, food allergies, right? I mean, we're more or less the same age, right? Do you remember growing up, like the kids with the nut allergies were like, you wrapped them in a bubble? They were like, the bubble. They're like, what is the kid's gonna die? Now there's like the gluten-free table, the veggie table, the nut-free table. It's just part of the zeitgeist now. So,
Yes.
I mean, knock wood, that's what I would love to see my kids be, in a few years.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I think it's just getting more and more integrated into sort of the fabric of school and work and media and so forth. And I'm looking forward to diving into each of those areas and figuring out how we can do the best job as psychologists and neuropsychologists as we can. So I'll start with a question that's always the top of the podcast, which is, why is this important? Of all the things that you could, spend your life, energy, emotions on, why this?
The biggest thing for me is that I grew up as a gifted kid. So, I grew up as a gifted kid in New Jersey in the 90s, and I'm from a small town with really good public schools, and they were they had no idea what to do with me, right? And I find it funny sort of to no end that you get this thing where, that's why you move to the town with the good public schools. And I didn't get a lot of those services, but, they cobbled something together. And then fast forward a few years, it's high school. I'm getting, I'm getting my, certainly up to my eyeballs in high school work. And at that point, they were like, you're really struggling more than we thought. Let's make sure we're not missing anything. Let's assess you for ADHD. And I basically broke the scale. So I was a twice exceptional kid all along, but I was so smart that and capable that no one ever checked. No one ever looked at for those things. And here I am now, like as an adult who specializes in working with kids like this, trying to make sure that I'm the adult for those kids that I needed growing up. So, it's I think like a lot of people in this field, this work is personal and professional. And the more I get to play in these spaces, the more I get to remind myself, it's like, right, that there are really good reasons to do this. There are kids who really need me out there. And, it's an honor to get to work with kids like that.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's such a cool way to think of it. It's funny. It sounds like we had somewhat parallel lives, different situation. I grew up as a gifted kid in a very, very small town in West Virginia. We did not have good public schools. And what that meant back then, if you were gifted, is that you got bused to some other not so great school and you got to play Oregon Trail all day on the computer because there was only one computer in the district, And so, of course, I loved it. But looking back, I'm thinking maybe that was not the most enriching environment. But yeah.
How much did that actually help me? Right. It's like,
sure. Yeah. We played Oregon Trail and did a bunch of those little logic puzzles with the matrix. And, if so-and-so has to get across the river in 2-step, that kind of thing. But their hat is yellow and they can't be with somebody else with a red hat. Anyway, that kind of thing. Lots of those games. So that's like many people, I think the personal motivates our work. And it sounds like you're in that camp as well. Well, let's jump into it. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. I'll start with some background, I think maybe just to set the stage. I know there's a lot of varying definitions and operationalization of neurodivergent out there, but I'd love to start with your definition just of neurodivergent. What is that? And then we can move to more of a definition of neurodivergent affirming. How about that?
So neurodivergent is a person who has a quantifiably different brain, right? So a person with a quantifiably different brain, as we can look at brain scans and we see that brain has functional and structural differences that make it different than a neurotypical brain, a brain that largely functions as we would expect a brain to function. Around 80% of people are neurotypical. So that number is both lower and higher than you'd expect, right?
Hmm.
Because it feels like everybody we see is somehow neurodivergent. They have a different brain because that's why they're ending up in our spaces, right? Because we're the translators. Like we get them from the neurodivergent world to how do you use that stuff to navigate the neurotypical world. But also, when I say those number to people, it's like, wait, so like 1 out of 5 kids is neurodivergent? I'm like, right. So in your classroom of 25 third graders, you've got probably 4 to 6 kids who are neurodivergent in some way. Now, that's not all gifted, right? Which is certainly my subspecialty, but it is the idea of ADHD, dyslexia, autism, OCD. When we combine those things, we're looking at about 1 in 5 kids.
Hmm.
So, and I always start my definitions with the neuroscience, right? Because you still see people out there who are like, ADHD, isn't that too much sugar? I hear autism, and that's just bad parenting. Dyslexia, well, those kids just aren't trying hard enough. And you hear those well-worn chestnuts, right? So I'm like,
Hmm.
these are brain things. I can point to a brain scan and say, this is a dyslexia brain, this is a gifted brain, because it gives us that counter narrative to the idea that this is the kid's fault somehow, rather than this flows from a literal brain difference.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. I want to dig into that just a little bit because you mentioned OCD, so that was interesting. That grabbed my attention. I feel like um, there's some discussion around whether or not emotional concerns, we'll just say emotional concerns, get lumped into neurodivergence. And I'm not sure if you split OCD off from like anxiety and depression or even PTSD. I've seen that kind of lumped in. Like how broad does the umbrella get as far as you're concerned in terms of, a quantifiably different brain?
So I put OCD in there because the recent studies out of Penn State did a study on this, and I believe it was Vanderbilt.
Hmm.
And they found that the basal ganglia, which is a reward circuit in the middle of our brain, is quantifiably different in OCD kids, right? So it really is a brain difference. Now, obviously, OCD shows up in all sorts of different ways. And I think OCD has not been as readily looped into the neurodivergent spaces, especially with kids in school, because OCD doesn't necessarily impact learning in the same way that ADHD, autism, dyslexia, giftedness do. But I see the kids who have that perfectionistic, morality driven, you see a lot of that co-occurring with autism and giftedness. So I list it because it becomes to me more of a social emotional neurodivergence in addition to its impacts on obviously how we navigate the world.
Hmm.
Uh, but when I would say like depression, anxiety disorders, panic attacks, to me that's mental illness. It's a different category. And those things can be related to neurodivergences. In fact, they usually sort of flow from that neurodivergence. I'm depressed because I have ADHD and I can't figure out how to survive in this world. Um, but what we're really looking at here is functional brain differences that flow downhill into behavioral and emotional changes. Something like PTSD, to your point, that's what we would call an acquired neurodivergence,
Hmm.
right? So a lot of this stuff is neurodevelopmental, right? The brain changes based on its developmental trajectories, but concussions, TBI, long COVID, these things are all acquired neurodivergences. I've had 4 concussions, right?
Hmm.
And my neurologist, who yells at me all the time for stuff like that, she's like, yo, you specialize with people with different brains? Well, she's like, your brain's been different quite a bit. I'm like, yes, it has. But thankfully, all of those concussions have healed and my brain has returned to its sort of typical neurodivergence. um,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. Baseline neurodivergence. Yes.
Yeah. Just the
Right.
normal
Right.
ways that I'm weird, right?
Fair enough. Fair enough. So let me throw one more thing in there just to get your thoughts at the risk of stirring up a whole bunch of trouble. But asking these questions I think is important. I've also seen like gender identity, gender diversity, that kind of thing lumped in with neurodivergence. I'm curious how you approach that as well.
I love that you asked that question, right? Because we have to be willing and able to have these conversations. What we know is that there's a significant overlap within the LGBTQ community and the neurodivergent community. And the number that gets cited all the time is somewhere between 38 and 70%. That's a lot of people, right? That is somewhere around, if we split the difference, we call it half, right? And when I think about my clients, who I see primarily neurodivergent people, I have a highly LGBTQ, you know, group that I see. Now, it's not always the presenting concern, it's not always the thing, but it's part of that conceptualization. Now, what does that mean? Gosh, I wish I could tell you, right? I mean, our awareness of these brain differences is in many ways in its infancy. We are just learning how to do this stuff. And, I've heard a lot of different theories thrown around the campfire. I think they're interesting. They're worth further study. I don't have access to a research lab, so I can't do that work anymore. But so what I would say is it definitely has something to do with neurodivergence, but we don't have enough information to draw any meaningful conclusions on it yet. So I would say that it's a correlation, not a causation at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah, I really look forward to digging in and getting some of the research. I know it's out there. I know people are doing it. I just want to see more of it. Yeah. And these are
That makes
tough. Right. So let's talk about neurodivergent affirming. How would you define that?
So let's use a metaphor here, right? Let's say that everybody in your life is about 6 feet tall, right? They're about average height for an American male, And Jeremy, how tall are you?
Well, I'm 6 feet tall.
Right. I am also 6 feet tall, right?
Yeah.
So we are typical in this particular iteration of things. Now, if you've got a person in your life who's 6'10", that is a person who is quantifiably different. They're in some sort of higher percentile of human height. Now, that height isn't better or worse than anything else, right? It is just, they're just taller, right? They might be better at basketball. They might be able to get that thing off the top shelf in the garage, and we're very excited about that. But it's not meaningfully superior. And I think it's important to push back against that narrative. So if I was going to build a home for that person, I wouldn't assume that the person I'm building this home for is about 6 foot tall. So I'd make my door frame is about 7 feet tall, right? Because that's your standard American door frame height. If I ask the question of my client, hey, how tall are you as I build your house? And they say, I'm 6'10", I'm going to build those doors bigger because I want to affirm that person's way of seeing the world. And that's really challenging to do, right? Because you have to do a lot of things differently than how the world is set up. The world is set up to teach and serve the middle of people where most people are, right? And my favorite exercise to do on this is, right, if you're having a dinner party, Jeremy, what would you cook for your dinner party?
Ooh, so I don't eat a lot of meat, if any. I always say 90% vegan. And so I would lean in that direction, right?
Right.
I'd lean in that direction and probably do more of a plant-based meal.
Love it. And so actually we're going to invert this because I usually do it the other way, but it's your home. You're cooking a plant-based meal for us, and let's say I'm coming and I'm like, Jeremy, man, I would love to get down with those Impossible Burgers. I just can't, brother. I just it gives me the heebie-jeebies. Do you think you can throw a piece of chicken on the grill for me? Right. And, or an egg or some other
Sure.
thing. We find a way. You're going to build the thing you're doing around what you are most comfortable with, what serves the most people, right? School and work and society is built on that same idea, as it should be. We cannot hyper specify for every single person who walks through our door, but we also have to be willing to specify when those people walk through our door. So if I'm throwing a dinner party as a proud meat eater, I'm going to probably grill up a bunch of chicken. But if I know you're coming, I'm going to make sure you have an Impossible Burger, gluten-free bun, whatever the heck you need. And I'll even let you sit at our table and eat with
Oh
the
my
rest.
gosh, you are so gracious. I
You
can't
know,
wait
what
to.
can I say? I'm a saint. So, we can't, it is inefficient to plan a million different individual plans. So we're allowed to plan for the middle as long as we've built in the flexibility to adapt when a unique case walks through our door. And so that to me is what neurodivergent affirming is all about.
That's fair. That's fair. And that really, I think both of those examples, my veganism notwithstanding, it really gets at this idea that I've heard it described as just the idea that we're acknowledging that, the vast majority of circumstances, places, environments, processes in our at least U.S. culture are kind of geared toward the middle, and neurodivergent folks is not that there is anything wrong, quote unquote, or anything like that by any means. It's just a mismatch between how their brains work and the environment that exists in the majority of our culture and the majority of spaces.
Yeah.
Much like
And
the 6'10" individual, they're going to have a hard time in most cars, right?
yeah.
So,
And there's this idea here that that is a fundamental tenet of the neurodiversity movement is that differences aren't deficits.
yes.
We tend to see people through the lens of this idea that, well, why are you different? Why is this harder? I mean, I don't know a single person on this planet who would choose to have ADHD. It has some real strengths, but it makes a lot of things a lot harder.
Mm-hmm.
And all the parents out there who are trying to push their kids into the gifted program, giftedness as a neurodivergence comes with a lot of downsides in addition to its incredible strengths, right? So, one of my favorite things when I do a whole talk about like pushing back on the myths of being gifted.
Mm.
And my favorite one to say is like, "Oh, you're so lucky you have a gifted kid." And every parent in that room bursts out laughing. And they're like, "Oh my God, if only they knew." I'm like, exactly, if only they knew. It isn't some, greased skid path straight to Harvard, right? It's a
Far from it.
psychoeducational, emotional struggle.
Right. Right. It's interesting that you say that. I want to go back to the thing you said about nobody would choose to have ADHD. And yet, I think there's a lot of discussion and experience in my community, which is, neuropsychologists and psychologists doing testing. It seems like a lot of folks, kids, adolescents, and adults want to be identified as neurodivergent in some way. What can you speak to that at all? Does that match what you're seeing, or if not, how do we navigate that?
So there's definitely the culture shift is real around this. I mean, the
Mm,
conversations we're having about this it's out in the open now. It's not this like secret thing like I don't tell anybody. Right.
mhm,
Now kids are on TikTok like all like this is my favorite ADHD content creator. It's like,
mhm,
as a member of that community, I'm like, yes. Oh, it's so cool that this thing is out there now. That makes me
mhm,
very happy. And I tend to be of the mindset that if I'm going to miss, I want to miss by over including people, not over excluding people. So if there are a few kids out there who think they have ADHD who don't, well, they're still going to benefit from the structures and systems we would use to support ADHD learners, right? Emailing homework home, well, that's just a good idea, right? sending reminders to that kid. That's just a good idea, right? The structures that we can put in to support neurodivergent kids really just remind us that the best practices in special education are just the best practices, full stop. So everyone benefits. So what do we have to lose? The only thing I would be worried about would be, just having a kid who's on medication who doesn't need to be. But, that's why we're getting a secondary person, having a medical professional look at that to make sure we're not missing that side of things.
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, I do worry about the over pathologizing, but that I guess assumes that you're giving diagnoses that don't necessarily fit. And you're right that a lot of interventions that we talk about are just helpful for people, independent of diagnosis, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and that's fair. That's a great point. That's a great point. I Before we leave that topic, I would love just to hear how you approach some of those situations. I'm guessing you've run into situations where folks come in, kids or adolescents, and they are maybe over-identified with some diagnosis or neurodivergence, and you maybe have to have a conversation around, well, I don't think this is really what's happening for you, but maybe it's something different. How do you approach those conversations when they come up?
I think it's helpful to ground these conversations in what we would, what I like to call the big three, right? Frequency, intensity, and duration. So everybody has moments where they're down, right? They're down in the dumps, right? How often is that happening? How intense are those feelings and how long do they last? Because the difference between I'm in a funk for a few days and I'm clinically depressed, right? Everybody, especially kids who are growing up and their brains are rapidly changing, have moments of executive dysfunction. It's not uncommon to forget what your mom asked you to buy you at the store, or to forget to clean your room, or to lose your car keys. Like, basically all humans do that. But how often does that happen? How intense is the forgetting? And how long do those things last, right? What, to me, the biggest marker of true ADHD is the emotional stuff that I mean, listen, I didn't feel like they told me about that growing up. I feel like ADHD was seen very much as this sort of executive functioning. You can't find the things, you're spacing out, you can't keep your focus. It was very like performance based. But I think now a lot of information, for Russell Barkley's team at University of South Carolina, to Lawrence Fung and his team at Stanford, right? You're seeing these researchers show like one of the biggest symptomologies of ADHD is the emotional side. The rejection sensitivity dysphoria, the impulsive anger. I mean, that's the stuff that when I probe these questions with these kiddos, I'm like, so sometimes you forget things and sometimes you lose things. That's okay. That's we're moving along the diagnostic trail. Tell me, do you ever have this emotional symptom? And that's when they'll go, oh gosh, no, that doesn't happen to me. That doesn't mean they do or don't have ADHD, but it means that we are approaching these questions from a place of diagnostic nuance that, and I mean no insult to TikTok here, that TikTok just can't handle. Right, we're always going to have a job, but it's cool that these kids are driving these questions now.
I agree. I ultimately, a lot of folks demonize TikTok, and I don't love it by any means. I think the research is showing, as far as we can tell, like fully 50% of mental health information on TikTok is incorrect, I think is what I'm seeing. So it's not great, but I do like that it's increased the awareness of mental health and maybe decreased the stigma, and ultimately leading more people to our offices, hopefully, so that we can work with them in an affirming and accurate way.
I mean, I like to call that phenomenon fence posting. Like, instead of having to start my client from scratch, I can sort of take the information as a fence post and lead that fence in a different direction. Like, I had a kid say to me the other day, it's like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm autistic because both of my parents are on are in IT. Okay, so there's a common misconception. Well, there's a common perception out there that a lot of IT professionals are autistic.
Mm-hmm.
This who is very neurodivergent was like, "Am I autistic because of this?" I'm like, "Well, dude, it may not be that simple, right? Your parents both have neurotypes, and that genetic thing made you. Let's explore those questions." But once again, correlation, not causation. I've got autistic adults in the restaurant industry and in law enforcement and in architecture and in childcare and in education and in mental health, right? So it's not a directionality thing. It's a, are these things co-occurring? But now I don't have to start that conversation at zero. I can take what my client knows and gently direct them to a more factual place,
Mm-hmm.
which is perhaps the most psychology thing I've ever said. Like, ooh, that
That's
was a well
good.
frame. Yeah.
That was really good. I like the term fence posting too. I'm gonna take that and work it into
Absolutely, my
as
friend.
many conversations. So let's talk about the actual concrete tips, strategies. People love that stuff. And you really specialize in this, like neurodiversity affirming practice. And there are several aspects of the client experience, I think, that we could touch on that we may not be thinking about. So maybe we start with a website. You brought that up as a place that we could be more affirming. So let's start there.
So one of the things that we unwittingly do is we all end up doing things that are more ableist than we mean them to, right? And I say, there's a difference between intention and impact here. We
Mm,
may not we may not intend to be ableist, but the impact of our actions, if it's ableist, is that we're still excluding people, right? So both of those things can be true. So
of course.
the reason I start the conversation there is your website designed for people of different ability levels and neurotypes to navigate? And I think a lot of I have a colleague, and she and I were just talking about this. Her website is gorgeous. It's like a Pinterest board come to life. It's amazing. But all the links are hidden in the flowers and stuff that are on this beautiful website. And
Mm,
I was like, hey, like, as a person who loves beauty and design, top notch. As a neurodivergent affirming person, you're missing the mark here, because if I am ADHDer and I'm looking at your website and I don't see that link, here's how to book, I'm gonna navigate to the next page, right? I'm
yep.
confused, lost, right? And so what I'm seeing a lot of people do now is having basically a plain text version of their website that you can click to that strips out all the pretty stuff that makes us stand out from the other therapists, to like, book me, my rates, here's my Calendly, go. Right? It's like, there you go. That's helpful to people who are overwhelmed by visual stimuli, or people perhaps who have some visual impairments, who just need to strip out all the noise and, just the facts, ma'am. Right? So those are little ways we can be neurodivergent and affirming. We also want to allow our clients to give us their backstories in multiple different ways, right? Maybe it's an intake form, Google form you just fill out. That's, a lot of people can do that. One of my colleague Gordon Smith, he's an amazing therapist for the neurodivergent community. He allows people to just do a voice memo, just click record and just vomit the information to him,
Huh.
because right, and it's like he sends that through an otter. The otter does voice to text. He gets the same content, but it's a little bit easier for people to do that. I don't know about you. I hate filling out forms online. I find it
Yeah,
very
it
great.
sucks.
Like, "Ugh," right?
Yeah.
And so, and I'm seeing people use more like click down menus, like, this, or this. I mean,
Hmm.
it's ways you're lowering the barrier to entry by having multiple ways in. And I think that helps everybody do better.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. Let's think about that voice memo idea. And to your point from earlier, what's good for, you said special ed recommendations are kind of just good for everybody. I think that's true for website design too. Like your website should be simple and easy to navigate and, big buttons and clear calls to action and that kind of thing. So that's going to benefit everyone, not just neurodivergent folks.
Right. And that
Yeah.
it gets back to that idea once again that the best practices in serving neurodivergent people are just the best practices, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, have you ever seen that cartoon? It floats around the internet where you've got it's like a wintry day, and all the kids are waiting to climb into the school, and the janitor is like shoveling the stairs, and the kid in the wheelchair is saying, "Hey, can you shovel my ramp?" And the guy's like, "Well, as soon as I finish with the stairs, son." He's like, "Well, if you shovel the ramp, everybody can get in."
Mm-hmm. Right.
Uh,
Right.
is it really that simple? Because maybe it's just that simple.
Right. I know. Like mind blown. What? Yeah. It's so true though. It's so true. We get wrapped up in all these nuances and quote unquote unique accommodations, but it really most of the time just works for everyone and it's just fine. So started with website, you dipped into the scheduling process and sort of onboarding process. Are there other ideas there that to be more affirming? Let's take a break to hear from our featured partner. Y'all know that the Brief 2 has long been established as one of the leading forms for measuring executive functioning in children. Now comes the latest addition to the Brief 2 family, the Brief 2A. This update will allow you to use the gold standard in executive functioning to assess adult clients. And you don't have to wait. It's available for pre-order right now. Learn more at parinc.com/products/BRIEF2A. Y'all know that I love therapy notes, but I am not the only one. They have a 4.9 out of 5-star rating on trustpilot.com and Google, which makes them the #1 rated electronic health record system available for mental health folks today. They make billing, scheduling, note-taking, and telehealth all incredibly easy. They also offer custom forms that you can send through the portal. For all the prescribers out there, Therapy Notes is proudly offering e-prescribe as well. And maybe the most important thing for me is that they have live telephone support 7 days a week, so you can actually talk to a real person in a timely manner. If you're trying to switch from another EHR, the transition is incredibly easy. They'll import your demographic data free of charge, so you can get going right away. So if you're curious, or you want to switch, or you need a new EHR, try Therapy Notes for 2 months, absolutely free. You can go to thetestingpsychologist.com/therapy notes and enter the code TESTING. Again, totally free, no strings attached. Check it out and see why everyone is switching to Therapy Notes. Let's get back to the podcast.
So, I mean, this is the thing that I struggle with a lot. And, and I would ask you here if you feel comfortable sharing, what's your cancellation no-show policy?
Pretty standard, I think. It's for testing, it's 48 hours. We ask people to cancel 48 hours before the appointment, or we charge the fee.
Right. And that's very similar to mine, and I sometimes go back and forth on this because I do think structure and accountability are good tools for the neurodivergent community to, we need to give them those things. And also there's something that just feels sort of fundamentally icky about taking people who have trouble with scheduling and time management and punishing them financially for not attending a thing. Right. And it's like, there's always this balance. So I've fallen, and it's different because I do more therapy. So it's the hourly block that's easier to reschedule. But this cracks me up. So we get this, I'll tell my kids, I'm like, if you missed the appointment, if you can reschedule with me this week, I won't charge you. Right.
That's cool. We do the same thing, actually. If you can reschedule within the same week, we're happy to do that. Yeah.
And that's a And it's become a much more affirming practice for me. Because yes, our time has value, and and I don't love charging people when I'm not seeing them. Also, I do need to keep my lights on, right? It is a
Of
business.
course.
So, and we use therapy notes for our EMR, and I've
Same.
set therapy notes to send every reminder short of skywriting. It's like email, text alert, go on your Google Calendar. And I still have people forget, but at least I
Yeah.
know I've covered my bases. It's not like, you know, I found booking this website with you very neurodivergent affirming. You send me a lot of reminders. So
Mm.
I'm up, there's the thing, and it's on my calendar. And I got a reminder yesterday, I got a reminder today. So I'm not going to miss this session. But sometimes
Mhm.
you book a podcast and they're like, cool, I'll see you in November. And it's just crickets until
Radio
that,
silence. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Are you still alive?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, I go back and forth on the reminders. Honestly, I'm like, is this too much? Is this overkill? But I've never been, what's the word? Annoyed myself by too many reminders. It's always good. It's always good because it goes the other direction too. Like you were kind of alluding to with the podcast, like it also makes sure that whoever you're scheduling with has it on their calendar, right? Like you didn't misunderstand or mishear or, write it down wrong. So it goes both directions. I think it keeps both people accountable.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
What do you think about self-scheduling? I know this might be a little bit different for therapy versus testing, but there are a lot of testing folks out there that will experiment with self-scheduling. But how does that fall on the spectrum of affirming?
When I worked in a group practice when I was getting my hours for licensure, we had self-scheduling through our through that website.
Mm-hmm.
Largely it was a good thing. I pushed for a way to schedule the clients for them, because I found that sometimes you do a session and you're like, great, I'll see you next week. And like, cool. And then they leave and the thought immediately goes out of their head. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, but hey, listen, I'll just put that on the schedule for you right now. Click, click, boom, which is what I can do in therapy notes, right? That's easy.
Yes.
I only had one guy ever misuse it. He booked himself 7 times in a week for me.
Okay.
A very sort of hypomanic guy with a history of compulsive therapy use and hoarding behavior. It was, the kind of case you want to talk about in grad school, like,
Mm.
oh, this is a fascinating case. But in terms of like, that's a lot that's a lot.
Sure.
7 times a week. That's just a lot of that. Right.
Yes.
So I called him. I'm like, listen, I can't see you 7 times. He said, but you had availability. I did. That is true. I have many other clients who haven't scheduled yet. And he's like, it's not my problem. So that balance is,
Yeah.
And I would love nothing more than to send all of my clients to a secure website and say, hey, definitely want to see you next week. Here's my availability, fill it in. Right. Because then that puts the client in the driver's seat and has you and I do more of the clinical work using our actual skill, rather than spending a lot of time confirming and reconfirming appointments with families, which is just a lot of drudgery. Right. And
Yes.
it's a
Yes.
I've not found a solution I like yet, but I would be
Mhm.
absolutely open to one should it present itself.
That's fair. I think I'm in the same boat. Yeah. What about paperwork? Anything that we need to consider with our paperwork? Your face says yes.
Oh,
I
gosh.
can't wait.
I sat on a panel last year at a conference where we had the conversation about, is not taking insurance neurodivergent and affirming?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Fascinating panel. People got very passionate about it. And
Yeah.
and like a true mental health professional, I talked out of both sides of my mouth. I'm like, well, here's the good stuff, but here's also the bad stuff. I mean, a lot less paperwork, a lot less oversight, a lot less stuff you got to do, right? We create super bills, send them to your insurance company. It's easy for me to sign up as a non-network provider, so they know I exist. I think I'm non-network in like Aetna, Blue Cross, a couple other ones, right? that's sure, I'll do that for my clients, but it also sort of s- pushes us in a way that therapy and testing should not be for the 1%, right?
Mhm.
And if I'm asking someone to pay out of pocket to either full stop or to hopefully get reimbursed at some point, I am cutting the number of people I can serve in half. So, I think that paperwork thing is I'm trying to get as I'm trying to get the most important information up front and use my EMR to fill in information as I go. And that's a cool feature, at least in therapy notes, where I can add in, oh, I just learned about their religion, or I just learned about their family history, or I didn't know that they were arrested when they were 19 for drunk driving. I'm going to add that into the file now.
Mhm.
Versus you got to fill out this 4-page packet of information in my waiting room, which you may not want to do. You may not feel comfortable doing. You may not have you may, if you're dysgraphic or dyslexic, you may not even be able to do so. So I think that nimbleness, that flexibility is always going to be the name of the game there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's reasonable. Let's move to the clinical process a little bit more. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. I'd love to talk about strategies for client interaction. Let's say like interviewing or intake,
Yeah.
how can we be more affirming in those practices?
I think the biggest thing I have found, and it's a thing I actually end up having to say to parents a lot,
Hmm.
is you have to understand that this therapy isn't always going to look like therapy.
Hmm.
And I cannot tell you how many sessions I've done with clients over the years, like my neurodivergent kiddos, where it's like our therapy session per se is them talking about the Star Trek fan fiction they wrote, and they're showing me the link on the website, and it's absolutely a thing, right? So, and like, so the parents are like, "Well, you didn't get anything done today. You didn't work on their ADHD today." And it's like,
Mhm.
you're not wrong, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
However, let me gently say that this kid trusts me more today,
Yeah.
right? This is a kiddo who showed me their world, and I opened that door and went with them, right? I went to Mordor with them. I didn't just say, excuse me, we're supposed to be on the path to Eldenwood. Like, sometimes you've got to do things that are very atypical
Mhm.
to get these kids to open up to you. I also think that I think with a lot of times with neurodivergent people, you can't walk through the front door. In an ideal therapy session, it's like, listen, we need to talk about your childhood. Okay, right. But a lot of neurodivergent people have built a lot of walls and boundaries. So sometimes you got to be willing to go through the side door, right? You've got to be willing to address things in a more roundabout way and trust yourself as a clinician to guide the train there, but also trust your client that when they're comfortable, they will go there with you, right?
Mhm.
And I think that every so often when I see a neurotypical client, I'm reminded that therapy is never easy, but it can be much easier with some people. It's like, oh, you're just here to talk about. Oh, great. So, by all means, tell me about your husband. I'm here for it, right? And then I sort of put my hands behind my head and I just kick my feet back and relax. But you've got to be willing to get on the wavelength of the people you're seeing, and that means, I think, moving away a little bit from the therapist as God model, as
Sure.
from the therapist as a collaborator model.
Mhm.
And that's hard for a lot of our colleagues. I think, we got these fancy doctorates for a reason. We kind of want to be the boss, but
Right. Or be helpful. I think that's where I personally get wrapped up back when I was doing more therapy is, if we got off the plan, so to speak, I would really have these concerns about not being helpful. I'm like, this isn't help. We're not doing anything. We're not being productive. Right. And over time, I think I've let go of that as much as I can. But yeah, it just speaks to that point. It's okay to just do some joining and chatting about things that may not immediately be productive.
Right. Well, and isn't it fascinating, right, to think about like what does productive mean for our clients, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, part of one of the many reasons I don't take insurance is that I got really tired of an insurance company saying to me, you got 12 sessions to fix this kid's OCD.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so I have to get a lot done. I have to move quickly. This work, it's an art and a science. Like sometimes you got to do a session about the drama in middle school so your kid knows they'll listen to you. And or you talk about the Star Wars build that they're doing in their Lego set in their basement. Those things are not by the manual, the classic CBT approach to OCD, but there has to be room for us to do stuff like that with our clients. Or we risk losing them and they sort of fall out of therapy. One of my kids that I see, she has an auditory processing disorder. So she finds the telehealth with the video very overwhelming.
Mm.
So we talk on the phone more often than not. And when she's having a bad sensory day, we text. We do our sessions via text.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little inelegant, right? But it gets the job done. It's meeting my client where she is and then doing what I can from that place.
Yeah, that seems to be the theme here is flexibility and adaptability and being willing to go off script a little bit and do what the client needs. Seems like a no-brainer, but it's harder. It's harder to put into practice.
Really sometimes. Should be, right? Like really should be a no-brainer.
Sure. Let's talk about the testing process. And I know you do primarily therapy, but also have, a lot of experience with testing. And maybe I would lump the environment into that area as well. So yeah, maybe we tackle that at this point.
So my mentor, Dr. Michael Cassano, he really was the guy who taught me how to test kids. And we didn't use that language at the time, but very neurodivergent affirming. He's like, I used to work at a therapeutic school for kids in Maine. And a lot of times kids would be so full of energy, they couldn't sit in my testing room. And we would just walk the track. He's like, so I had every question for vocab and every question for similarities memorized because I could just recite those questions. Right. And he's like, I knew enough that it was a 2-point, 1-point, or 0-point answer. And you can't do everything like that, of course, right? You kind of need the kid to see matrix reasoning to do matrix reasoning. But there's a lot of them you can do playing to that kid's physical, emotional, sensory needs. I mean, you read my reports, it's like we conducted visual puzzles with the client under the table because the client said they were overwhelmed. So I was like, here's the thing, point, tell me the answer, I'll write it down and then flip the page, right? Is it what the manual says we should do? No, it isn't. But the manual is built to serve typical kids, and these are not typical kids, right? I'm not going to let the kids look at the answers. I'm not going to give, a kid with auditory processing disorder more hints, right? I'm not going to give the ADHD kid, okay, you only need to choose between 2 answers, not 5, right? That's inappropriate. But, the structure of how we approach the testing process and, to your point, the physical space, I think we have a lot of adaptability in that, and that's really cool.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've heard some really cool stuff, just internet, Facebook groups and that sort of thing about even, like lighting in the waiting area, lighting in the testing area, not getting away from fluorescence, trying to do as much, non-fluorescent.
LEDs forever.
Yeah, little things like that. The magazines in the waiting space, the type of furniture that you're looking at, even the color palette, that kind of thing. Having a testing room that is safe enough where kids can move around and furniture that will accommodate, hanging upside down or, feet up on the couch or whatever it may be. Just little things like that make a big difference, I think. I wonder if that matches your experience as well, or if you have other thoughts.
It absolutely does. And, I mean, I'm thinking about a testing case I did once with a very anxious kid on the autism spectrum. And he was really into law enforcement, and he was having a lot of trouble providing verbal answers to me. So I said, well, what do police officers do when they need to talk to each other? Like, they talk on a walkie-talkie. I was like, now I don't have a walkie-talkie with me, but what if you gave me all your answers? Come back, breaker, breaker, breaker. Come on, this is high cap. And he just locked into that. So he gave me all of his answers via this invisible walkie-talkie. And and then around halfway through the session, he was like, can I bring out my stuffy? So now he's got the stuffy. Now sometimes the stuffy's giving me the answers, and sometimes he's talking on the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to work with an autistic person, I'm going to get the best version of that person through the things they need to do to survive, rather than saying, excuse me, in the testing process, you sit still in the chair and you can have no toys or fidgets or water. You're going to sit there and you're going to answer the freaking questions. There aren't that many people who can do that. And I'm sitting here doing this podcast with you. I'm having sips of my coffee because, my day started very early this morning. And if you were like, excuse me, we don't have beverages during our podcast, then I would be less effective as your podcast guest. So, I think as long as it doesn't detract from what we're here to do, which is answering the questions and figuring out how this kid's brain works, then I give my clients a wide swath of what they're able to do in those spaces, including just pacing around the room, as long as they're not looking at the answers over my shoulder. And I have had a few kids try to do that. It's like, oh, I'm just, like when you were in middle school and you like got up to sharpen your pencil and you're like, what did you get for number 7? -3. Interesting.
Oh.
Not that I ever did that, of course, but
Never. Me neither. For sure. I mean, I love that idea. I feel like we do a lot of testing with kids and sometimes adults, not sitting where they're quote unquote supposed to sit. There's a lot of on the floor, moving around, walking, standing, jumping, all those things. That's great. Now, let's talk about the report. Are there neurodiversity affirming writing styles or even text layouts or, considerations with the report that we could keep in mind?
What I usually do is do a feedback session with my client and give them a one-pager with bullet points that really says, here are the things you need to know based on this report, right? Because there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of unnecessary stuff that we sort of, if I'm doing doc to doc, I know you need to know these pieces of information, right?
Yeah.
I'm basically saying, here are the most important recommendations. Here's the diagnosis. Here's how I got there. Here are the strengths and weaknesses. And here's how you talk about this to your HR rep, to your school principal, to your school psychologist.
Yes.
When I do the report itself, I usually make two versions. One, I'll do sort of my standard Times New Roman size 12 font, but there are special fonts that you can download as a macro for Word that are more readable for the dyslexic community. Start bold and fade. And what that does is it re-engages the optic cortex every time a word starts. And dyslexic people have found that it's significantly easier for them to read. And I might make the font size bigger and have like 1.5 spaces. So now there's a little bit more visual space, because what do I care if I'm just emailing a PDF copy? I'm not killing any trees this way. So I'm sending my client a copy that's more readable to them. And And I think
Right.
even asking that question to your clients, are you somebody who listens to podcasts at 1.5 speed? Do you, on your Kindle, what sizes are the words? Asking those questions tell our clients we care about who they are and what their neuro what their neurodivergent experience is for them. Asking those questions align us with what they might need. When we know what they might need, we're more able to give it to them.
I love that. Where in this whole process are you asking those questions? I mean, is it happening along the way? Is it at feedback?
So I usually ask, I try to remember to ask it in the onboarding process. I don't
Mhm,
always remember.
mhm,
So
mhm.
when I finish the testing process and I do my feedback session, I was like, when I create the report, is there anything I can do to make this report more accessible for you?
Mm.
And and I actually had a client tell me this the other day. It's because an open-ended question for somebody who doesn't know what they need to know is potentially problematic, right? Because she's like, give me a few more options. Like, what is it? How can I make this more affirming for you? I don't know. Can you come over to my house and do it in interpretive dance? Can you like make it a graphic novel? You have Morgan Freeman like narrate it? Like, I don't know. Like,
That'd
so
be
I started
awesome.
talking about like fonting and spacing and stuff like that, making it more concrete.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. Well, and it makes me think about, I'm just thinking about this right now, so I don't have the answer, but are there different file formats that are easier to go text to speech? Is it, I don't know, Word better for that, or a PDF, or some other format I'm not thinking of? Just little things like that.
And I don't know the answer to that, but that's a thing we could absolutely figure out. And that's sort of the beauty of all this because we get to learn and grow along with our clients, right? Like Maya Angelou always said, the do as well as you can until you know better and then do better.
Mm, it's a great way to put it. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I feel like, just to zoom back out a little bit, talking about this stuff can be pretty fraught for clinicians. It's one of those areas I think where a lot of us are afraid of doing the wrong thing or making a misstep or saying something offensive or not doing something correctly. And it's just a good reminder that having a sort of perpetual learning mindset or growth mindset is really valuable, and it's okay to keep learning along the way. You don't have to have it all figured out from the very beginning.
I think that I think that kind of intellectual humility plays
Mm.
very well with this population. And my clients constantly ask me questions. They constantly challenge me on stuff. And sometimes it's like, no, I do this for a reason, and here's why. I can show my work and justify my choices. And sometimes I hang up the call and go, damn, do I need to do this better? And and I can't always fix those problems, but I can absolutely hear them out and think about where do I go from here?
Right, right. I think that's the best that we can do. That's the best we can ask for. At least consider it. See what could be different. Do our best.
Absolutely.
Well, we've talked about a lot of different things. As usual, there's much more that we could talk about, but I appreciate this. I mean, it's kind of a broad perspective. I think we touched on a lot of different areas and topics that will be helpful for folks if they do want to either reach out or learn more or get more info from you. What's the best way to do that?
I have I have sort of two primary online presences. The first is our therapy practice, which is the Neurodiversity Collective. That's myself and my colleagues. We see people from all over the country.
Mm,
You can't really do testing virtually, but we can do therapy virtually.
nice.
Um, so as I say to people, if you think I can help you, you contact the Neurodiversity Collective. If you think I can help your organization, whether that's a school or a college or a business or your community organization, then you contact drmattzakreski.com. That's where I do my speaking, my consulting, my training. So I just sort of try and keep those two businesses separate because it's two different parts of what I do.
That makes sense. I do the same thing. Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. I know you do a lot of this stuff, and I'm just appreciative for your time and willingness to dive into a pretty important topic. Thanks for being here.
Well, and you created the space. I mean, it's so cool to be able to talk, doc to doc in this way and talk to another mental health professional who really understands this stuff, right? And I feel like a lot of times I'm talking to educators and parents, which is so important. But it's really cool to get very high level and stay very high level. And I think we both got to learn something from each other, and I'm sure the audience will learn a lot from us too.
Yeah, I totally agree, and certainly hope so, and hope that maybe we'll talk again soon.
I would love that.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Always grateful to have you here. I hope that you take away some information that you can implement in your practice and in your life. Any resources that we mentioned during the episode will be listed in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. If you like what you hear on the podcast, I would be so grateful if you left a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're a practice owner or aspiring practice owner, I'd invite you to check out the Testing Psychologist mastermind groups. I have mastermind groups at every stage of practice development: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. We have homework, we have accountability, we have support, we have resources. These groups are amazing. We do a lot of work and a lot of connecting. If that sounds interesting to you, you can check out the details at thetestingpsychologist.com/consulting. You can sign up for a pre-group phone call, and we will chat and figure out if a group could be a good fit for you. Thanks so much. The information contained in this podcast and on the Testing Psychologist website are intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no doctor-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host or guests of this podcast and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of any mental health practitioner or medical provider, please seek one in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please find a supervisor with an expertise that fits your needs.